Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And the topic that we're going to try to make sense of is when faith and power mix. And before we bring on my guest, I want to talk a little bit about why I wanted to talk about this topic of when faith and power mix. And the reason is because we are, I believe, in the midst of a multi-year reckoning in the American church of the abuse of power. And we see this on multiple levels. There's just the general, if you will, abuse of power in institutions. Think, for example, of the recent revelations coming out from Hillsong. We are in a multi-year now reckoning, I think, in terms of the evangelical version of the Me Too movement, where we have seen the revelations and the reckoning of patterns of abuse of power directed towards women. Look just, for example, at the report from the Southern Baptist Convention on how it handled reports of sexual abuse. We are in a multi-year or multi-decade, I don't know how far this goes back, of an incomplete reckoning of the abuse of power directed at people of color, especially African Americans. We're in the 3-year anniversary of the George Floyd murder that showed just how far we still have to go in reckoning with that kind of abuse of power. And we're heading into 2024, where we're going to see, undoubtedly, once again, the toxic ways in which the pursuit of political power by American evangelicals results in very corrosive effects on the faith. So all of that, I think, can lead us as followers of Jesus to be almost allergic to power and the wielding of power, that we think we can be tempted to think that the problem is with power itself. And so we shouldn't mix faith and power. Those two should not touch. I actually see this in a lot of the emails I get from listeners. And interestingly, in a lot of conversations I have with young people, that they see this pattern of the abuse of power, and they feel like we just shouldn't have power as Christians at all. And this is why I want to talk about this topic of when faith and power mix, because I think we need a wiser view of how faith and power mix than simply, oh my gosh, power is bad, it's wrong, we should get away from it as much as possible. And real quick, why, as a quick theological riff on this, I think we need to go no further than the absolute formational sort of description of the human task in the world from Genesis 1:26-27, when God says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they, the corporate humanity, they may have dominion over, and then it lists all the aspects of creation. That the image of God, and theologians have talked a lot about what that means, but one thing it must absolutely include is the exercise of power, because that is what is defined as the image-bearing mandate of humanity, is that human beings are meant to have dominion over the world. And we see what that dominion is supposed to look like, because it's supposed to be imaging God. And we see in Genesis 1, this God who exercises power in the world to organize the world, to bring order to the world, and to bring new realities, to create new things in the world. And for us as human beings, we cannot bring order into the world unless we exercise power, oftentimes organizational power. That's what organizations are. Human organizations are order-making collectives. That's what organizations are. They organize the world. They bring order to the world. And this is why I've advocated for a long time to understand organizations as participating in the image of God. Or if you try to create anything in the world, it's almost impossible to create anything substantive in the world by yourself, that we need to do that together. So we need a wiser way to make sense of how faith and power mix. And this is why I'm excited to have my friend as a guest, Cherie Harder, who's the president of the Trinity Forum. Cherie, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Curtis.
Cherie, I've been waiting to introduce you in this way. So, Cherie, it's because when David French, Russell Moore, and I announced the after party at the Trinity Forum event in DC, this is a couple months ago, Cherie had this introduction of the three of us where she called us the three wise men. And I felt really, the three wise men of I guess, the evangelical church, I felt way underqualified for that. But I made a note. I'm going to get Cherie on my podcast, and I'm going to introduce her as the wise woman of the
Oh,
evangelical church. And I think that is an accurate depiction, because she absolutely is. When I think of women who have helped lead the church for a meaningful period of time and done so wisely, I think of Cherie. And so, Cherie, you're here to help us make sense of when faith and power mix. And I want you to begin by describing why the work of the Trinity Forum and why that's given you visibility into this mixture of faith and power.
Curtis, that was very gracious, undeserved, but it's great to be here. I really appreciate the question. So, Trinity Forum was started over 30 years ago with the purpose of cultivating, curating, and disseminating the best of Christian thought and providing a space for leaders to wrestle together with the big questions of life, but in the context of faith. And so, because so many of the people that we served were in leadership positions, we're needing to deal with questions of power and influence and responsibility. In some ways, those questions have been part and parcel of Trinity Forum ever since its inception, which predates me by over a dozen years.
Describe the kind of power that the people in your network are wielding, wrestling with, figuring out how faith intersects with the holding of that power. What is it in is it, I imagine you're in DC, is it mostly in politics? Does it cover other sectors as well?
It certainly covers other sectors. DC is an industry town in some ways. A lot of people are involved in politics or policy in some way or the other, or law and legislation. But there's people from academia, from business, people from the nonprofit sector, people who need to hold some kind of responsibility, which is a form of power, one could say, or authority, whether it's in their community or their family or their church. Across sectors, there are people who hold power. And we could talk about what power is. I'm sort of using power in the sense of having the ability to make things happen, to create things and ideas and make sense of the world. And so, in those ways, almost all of us have power of some sort that we have an opportunity to steward, either for good or for ill.
I love that definition of power as the ability to do something in the world, which again points to that we need a wise understanding of how faith and power mix, other than just let's get away from power, because it's inescapable. The moment you get married, you have, or are in a romantic relationship of some sort, you are exercising some power in that relationship. You have a child, you have immense power because you have responsibility over another life. And this is why I think we have to have some more wise way of making sense of it. And that starts with the understanding that power is intended for good. That when God exercises power in the world in the Genesis 1, he says, he looks at what he's done with his power and he says, this is good. And so if we're, as human beings, meant to image God in that exercise of power in the world, we have to understand that it is fundamentally intended for good, and that the abuse of power is just that. It's the abuse of something that is good. We own our language of talking about abuse of power should reveal to us this instinctive recognition that power itself is intended for good, because you only abuse something that is meant for good. I mean, we don't ever say, when somebody kills somebody, wow, that was an abuse of murder. Like that was, murder is bad. So you don't abuse murder. You only abuse something that was good. So I want you to then talk about what you've seen as the good. What have you seen among your members, and as you've observed Christians wielding power, when have you seen it go right? When has it been good?
Yeah, that's a great question, Curtis. So, we do have different ways of thinking about power, and the sort of the working definition that we were just talking about, the ability to make things happen, the ability to be or make be, is essentially a creative act, and ideally a generative act. Um, Often we think about power almost solely in terms of the coercive. as opposed to the creative. And I think the creative versus coercive distinction is actually really an important one. And power is most easily abused when it is coercive
Yeah.
rather than creative. And often when we the abuses of power have become in many ways so widespread, as you were talking about in your introduction, that people tend to think about the abuse of power as power itself. But power wisely stewarded in terms of the ability to create and generate and make and call forth and generate ideas and make sense of the world is something that is profoundly good and that we were created to have. And there's several, I think, key characteristics of it. One is that it is something that we do with others, where coercive power tends to be zero sum.
Mm.
My gain
Yeah.
necessitates your loss.
Yeah. Top
Uh,
down, zero
that's
sum. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
You know, Creative power functions differently. It can be exercised for the flourishing of others. Often, a sacrificial act will be an act of power. Making something happen in a sacrificial way for the flourishing of others. And we see that. You mentioned the relationship between parents and their children. A baby comes into the world with very little raw power. Parents have a huge amount of power over that little one, but they're motivated by an extraordinary love. And so the love that kind of motivates the parents to make great sacrifices, to forego sleep, to provide for that child, to rush that child to the emergency room at 3 in the morning. All of that is an act of power and stewardship. They are doing something, of their own volition, but it's certainly not a coercive act. So coercion, I think, is one of the areas where power so easily tends to be abused, and one of the reasons why, because we often conflate coercion with power itself, that people get worried about, you know, power in general.
So, what would be some examples that you've seen in DC then of this creative, generative, shared power versus just strict coercive power? Are there good examples of this among Christians doing that in your network?
Oh, yeah, there is. And one recent sort of policy related example that I'll mention, and often it's hard to talk about policy outcomes in black and white terms. There's always all sorts of machinations and calculations and negotiations that go into them. But one relatively recent policy victory was PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which has saved, by some estimates, as many as 40 million lives in Africa. This was an effort that frankly required power, required a huge amount of effort, a large number of people working together to make something be, to create a new thing. And the new thing that was created was complex and large and expensive, but has also meant it literally the difference between life and death for millions of people, in Africa and beyond. And that's one example of something that, an act
Yeah.
of power. It was for the flourishing of others. It's very easy to come up with examples of people who have used power destructively. We can talk about some of that. But I also think that I think it was the philosopher Immanuel Kant who says that the actual proves the possible. There are real life examples of where power has been used for flourishing, used creatively and generatively, even in DC in the halls of Congress.
I love the example of PEPFAR because it is one of the best kept secrets of the great creative use of power and actually the role of Christians involved in that. I think I was telling my daughters about this. They're like, PEPFAR, I've never heard of it. I'm like, okay, it just happens to be the most sort of impactful public health initiative in human history, I think. Cherie, can you give a little more texture on the role of Christians in terms of people of faith in making PEPFAR happen. And again, just as a reminder, PEPFAR was this signature initiative to make a number of medical interventions, but especially antiretroviral medicines to combat AIDS in Africa that just, all historians would say has saved millions and millions of lives. So, but go back to what was the role of Christians in making PEPFAR happen. Tell that story a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question, Curtis. So Christians were very involved with this from really from the beginning and along almost every step of the journey. This was an idea that the President Bush invested a huge amount of time and effort in. There was not necessarily a united front within the White House. It was several Christians within the White House who pushed very vigorously for it. One example.
Can you say those names? Oh, I'm sorry. You were about to. Just, yeah. Because we know some of these people.
We do.
They're our friends.
we do indeed. Well, the late and extraordinary Michael Gerson, who was one of the president's speechwriters and top advisors, is someone who not just argued vociferously, worked tirelessly for the promotion and passage of PEPFAR. A number of the president's close advisors were big supporters. It required the involvement and the passage from Congress, and there was a lot of effort made to persuade members of Congress. For a while, the PEPFAR office at the State Department was actually led by one of my colleagues and one of your good friends, Tom Walsh, who oversaw the implementation of PEPFAR with all of its incredible complexity. Mark Lagon, who is also a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum at the State Department, was someone very involved in that effort and now heads up an entity that basically works with the UN to ensure that kind of aid is, continues to flow to people who need it. So there were Christians involved along every step of the way. And it is one of the extraordinary accomplishments, I think, really of this century. And as you were saying, it's one of the stories that largely goes untold.
Well, what I love about that story is also it's not just a story like happening among policymakers in the corridors of DC. As I understand the story, that a number of Republican lawmakers said to Christians, I think Bono being one of them, like, look, this is only going to happen if you can rally public support for this program. And a lot of what happened in terms of the One campaign that got tremendous amount of popularity was because Bono, other entertainers, Christian entertainment, rallied around it, built public support for it in a remarkable coalition that cut across partisan lines, cut across policy, entertainment, law lines. I mean, it was America at its best in terms of coming together, not just for itself and self-interest, but to actually save the lives of others, people who were, our neighbors, but ones we don't normally see. So it's a beautiful story of power on so many different fronts being exercised. So Cherie, here's my question then is, why don't we see more examples of PEPFAR? Why is it so hard to see that good redemptive use of power? What's going on such that makes it so difficult?
Well, I think the answer to that question is probably as old as the fall of man. In that it's been said that original sin is the only empirically demonstrable of the Christian doctrines. And,
That's right.
We're bent towards selfishness in many ways. And also affected by the fall is the fact that our judgment and our perception is similarly affected. It can be very easy to see how other people are either abusing power or pursuing their own self-interest at the expense of others, or just essentially pursuing a selfish agenda, and kind of harder to see it on our own. And it's also the difference between essentially pursuing that which is love and pursuing self-domination. What Augustine referred to like the libido dominandi, the desire to dominate, to basically expand our own territory at the expense of other people. And, that's a view of power that, kind of eventually has sort of devolved into a Nietzschean view where it's just like you want yourself to expand, to take over all of it. All of it is my territory, which in a way is a form of idolatry. It's, of course, it's, Kuyper talked about how, it was God who said, it's all mine. And when we try to make it all ours, we're running into real problems there in terms of abuse of power. But I'll also say one. It's much more common to find, the misuse of power, not in just the huge, dark, and dastardly, but in all of the little petty self-deceptions and petty advancements of self-interest that that I think in many ways we contort our faith or the language of faith to you know to advance and to excuse. Um, I'm thinking of one instance. Years ago, I was actually a boyfriend of mine was the chief of staff for a member of House leadership, and he had been telling me how in the last month or so, his boss. There had been at least 10 different members of Congress who had come in and sought an audience with his boss to tell the boss that they were pretty convinced that God was leading them to run for president. 10 of them.
Okay.
Presumably they were people, fairly sincere, had been praying, had been seeking God's guidance. It's unlikely, that God had been saying to all of them, all 10, that they should run for president. But it can be, I think, very easy for us to mistake our own wishes for the will of God. And I think often we use Christian language to cloak and disguise what's essentially our own self-interest.
Talk more about that dynamic and why it's so dangerous, about when we use faith. One way this faith and power mixes when we use faith to cloak the raw desire for especially coercive power, for self-serving power. Why is that so particular, that mixture so particularly dangerous?
Yeah. Boy, I mean, just looking at history and when religion has been instrumentalized, much less weaponized, to serve selfish interests and the like, there's something I think uniquely dark about that.
Mhm.
And there's plenty of examples from history when things go terribly wrong. You think about the French Revolution and how one of the slogans was to strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. I mean,
Right.
that's dark and awful,
Yeah.
but part of what led to that, you read not only your history books, you read literature. A Tale of Two Cities, where it sort of opens with a scene of a young French peasant being killed because he failed to kind of bow quickly enough to a priest. There's always a temptation to try to play God, to take on the role of God and to demand the worship. It's a form of idolatry. And almost all abuse of power is in some ways either a form of idolatry or injustice. Um,
So, Cherie, it strikes me that most Christians say that as they are heading to DC to take on some position of governmental or legal or other kind of power, they're not going in thinking, "Gosh, this is now my opportunity to practice the idolatry of power. Now is my chance to finally, wield self-serving power and use faith as a cloak." That process of where they end up in abusing power is a slower and much more subtle process of corruption, of slow abuse, of corrosive effects of that bad power. Um, as somebody who's been in DC for so long, I imagine you must see this process happen as you witness people come into the city, get into power, and then see what it does to them. Can you describe this process and what are the key markers? What are the dynamics that are going on, such that somebody otherwise well-intentioned coming in can get led down this path of abuse of power?
yeah. Boy, there's different routes, to that general direction, of course. Um, I'll mention a few that I've noticed. One is to start confusing ways and means with ends,
Yeah.
or to think that the end is so important that it justifies the means. That essentially. This moment is so important. This cause is so important. Uh, this policy or this law that it really doesn't matter if you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet or what have you. One example of this years ago when I was working for the Senate Majority Leader, I was meeting with a group of people who uh, were concerned about a particular bill. It was a hate crimes bill. They were not happy with it, and thought it was wrong. And at the time, my boss agreed with him, and I had met with him to basically say, look, right now we count 65 votes for this. The bill won't come up for a while, so essentially there's time, but you're going to have to engage in the old art of persuasion. And frankly, was feeling like I had given them pretty good policy and political advice. We were kind of united on the outcome, and hoped that they would go off and and work towards essentially peeling off a few votes and persuading a few people to think differently. And instead, one of the people I was meeting with, and this was a Christian group, she stood up, she slammed her hands down on the table, pointed to me, and said, "You are grieving God."
Oh my
And
goodness.
it was kind of a chilling moment. And
Yikes.
yes, looking back, I think she was sincere. I think it probably took a form of courage. Of in her mind, I think she was sort of speaking truth to power. The problem was she really saw Senate rules, even the law, as something that did not need to be followed, um, could and should be brushed aside because the cause was so important,
Hmm.
and that to fail to do so uh, was to itself be somehow disobedient, to God, whose law superseded the law of the land. And I think it was an illustration of how that kind of thinking happens. That the cause uh, basically justifies throwing across the restraints or constraints of the law itself, um, because what one believes needs to happen is far more important. Uh, and I'll also mention, so many of the fights that happen in Washington, while they are pitched, to the rest of the country as being Manichaean fights between good and evil, often really they are conflicts over tactics or
Hmm.
approaches or budgets. Rarely is it a straight up and down vote on a moral issue. It's almost always in the approach or the tactic, which is then kind of presented in a particular way in order to get attention, to get money, to get support, to get influence. And so I think that's a really important place to start, is to, uh, you know, essentially to insist that your ways and means need to be in accordance with your end. If what you aim for is a just, civil, charitable, and flourishing society, your your ways and means also need to be just, civil, charitable, and the like. You can't have ways and means that which contradict the ends. And a second thing I'll mention in regards to your question is the self deception that eventually comes with that. As believers, we do believe in the truth. We follow the way, the truth, and the life. But I think it's often very tempting to believe that because we follow the truth, we always have the truth,
Mm.
as opposed to kind of allowing for a healthy, what's been called epistemological modesty. That is,
Mhm.
the truth is there, and we worship the truth, but our own ability to always accurately perceive the truth in a given moment is one of the things affected by the fall. Our judgment is not always perfect, and so to kind of allow for that kind of humility in the way we conduct ourselves is important.
Well, and it seems like that would grant us greater humility for the possibility that even our opponent or the person standing in our way of our exercise of the power that may otherwise be for good intention purpose, we have to allow for that person or that party or that set of actors may know something about the truth that I don't know, and therefore it just needs to inject a certain level of restraint and humility in how much we exercise or how we exercise our power. Those are great insights. Bring it a little more practical, even more in a put on your pastor's hat here, Cherie. Like if you were to meet with some young 20 something who was arriving in DC for the first time, just like I think you did, years ago, what advice would you give that person to say, look, you're about to enter, the corridors of power. You're going to have, and your faith is going to be mixing with power. What are some things you would advise that person to start doing?
Yeah, great question. One of the most important things I think is to, whether it's one's church or one's small group, is to cultivate and stay in communion with fellow believers who can pray for you, who can challenge you, who can think with you, brainstorm with you, and the like. Uh, in that often it is by when we are isolated in some way that our judgment can become murkier. It's we're more likely to become either fearful or confused or
Hmm.
angry.
Hmm.
And it's fellowship, I think, that really helps keep us rooted, keep us
Hmm.
supported, but also kind of be a helpful sounding board in terms of thinking through things and thinking through challenges. So that's one, I think, really important thing to do. Another is simply to kind of remember one's limitations and creatureliness.
Hmm.
In that, you know, DC can be a very hard driving place. I've held jobs before, whether it's in the White House or otherwise, that felt totalizing at the time, where just, one was sprinting what felt like 10 or 11 hours a day, and then you go home and crash. And I think rarely do people make their best decisions when they are uh, exhausted, isolated, under-exercised, with insufficient sleep, poor eating habits, not enough time in nature, all of that kind of things. Spiritual disciplines are there for our flourishing, and we need to be able to take time off, to take time for thought and for prayer and the like. A third thing I'll mention is the need for institutional accountability and transparency. And for any young person, I would counsel them to be wary of people or organizations who fight against transparency
Hmm.
or institutional accountability. There's usually a reason for it.
Yeah, and it sounds like if you get ensconced into an institution that itself is trying to act obscurely, trying to avoid transparency, it seems to me that that institution is going to start forming you. It's not that just you're going to have to like tolerate it, but as a member of that institution, you will, as Yuval Levin talks about, you are entering in a formational vehicle such that your
Mhm.
own character is going to start matching your institution's character, right?
That's right. I mean, institutions have formative power and therefore deformative power.
That's right. Yeah.
And kind of related to that, I also think it's a helpful thing if when you're a young person and going to DC or elsewhere, uh, find a boss that you admire for good reasons,
Hmm.
and watch them. How do they do what they do? and to avoid bosses where you know from the outset that all is not well, because it will be very difficult to kind of resist being sucked in.
I think that is a fantastic bit of advice to select your jobs, and this is whether you're in DC or elsewhere, to select your jobs by the character of your boss with the question, do I want to become more like this person's character? It could be so easy to think that we select institutions for what they will give us on our resume. Like, will this boost us in our career path in some way? And I'll tolerate a bad boss or a bad work culture in order to get that marker on my resume. Far more formational for one's future is who is supervising you, shaping you, mentoring you, and who's around you in terms of your group culture. I think that is going to be far more formational for a young person's trajectory, because we become who we behold. We become who we behold around us every day in our work. And so I love that idea of really taking good stock of the character of your boss. Cherie, give us a little career tips on how you do this for a young person or any person of any age seeking their next job. If they were to take seriously this idea of, I really want to vet and make sure the character of my boss is going to be one that forms me in the right direction. And I would say, and I think you'll agree with this, doesn't mean that every boss has to be a Christian per se, but somebody of whose character is going to be aligned with your faith. How do you suss that out? How do you discover that?
Yeah. It's not like there's a matrix and here's exactly what you do. Some of it is
Yeah.
just by observation. And when one is like an entry level employee too, it's just going to be the way it is. Very few CEOs will be taking a lot of time to mentor, the entry level, employees, just, by nature of business. But I think, through observation, one can usually get a sense of how an organization runs, of how, what the management philosophy is. There's lots of questions one can ask in the interview about what kind of culture is developed here. What are the aims? What are the missional goals? How do people fit within it? What does success look like? Uh, to ask about mentorship opportunities, to ask about how employees are expected to interact with each other. Uh, there's a lot one can gain from an interview in better understanding how the leadership of that organization uh, sees sees the aims of the organization and sees the role that everybody plays within it. People rarely hide who they are for long periods of time.
Mm.
And there's a reason why people want to interview face to face. You gather a lot of information in both directions. And I think most people will be able to come out of an interview with a sense of, is this a place where power is used well or not?
Cherie, I want to turn the conversation to some of your own personal experiences, because you're a person of faith who have been walking in the various corridors of power in politics, in Christian nonprofit work. I want to ask you, as a woman of faith, if you could share what has your experience of been like as a woman traversing kind of the various realms of power, because we are seeing, as we talked about earlier, sort of this moment of reckoning where women have suffered sort of systematic abuse or other ill treatment by men in power. Like, so as somebody, as a woman who has been walking in those various corridors, can you just describe, as much as you're willing to, your own experience, and also like what's been changing among women and as they exercise and engage in power?
Yeah. Curtis, it's a big question. Um, I will say it was, well, there were a lot of surprises I had when I first came to Washington more than 30 years ago. Uh, in that I, was raised in a very conservative Christian home, and I had certain expectations about the ways that men in power would behave, and frankly, had sort of been raised to think that if a man in a position of authority were upset with me, it was my fault.
Mm.
And you know, uh, was exposed at a fairly early age to bad behavior on the part of men with some power and influence, and learned in many ways like that. The fact that someone called themselves a Christian didn't necessarily mean that they always behaved or
Yeah.
used that power in ways that were honoring to God. Have seen many instances. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, where people essentially instrumentalized or even weaponized their faith towards destructive ends, or had a certain ideology uh, that was bathed in Christian language that would somehow kind of justify treating women as less than in some ways. One time, this is a very minor example, but I was working for a senator. This was over 20 years ago. And the senator and I and one other staff member, who I was senior to, met with a late, but at the time very well known ministry founder. And that ministry founder would talk with the senator and would speak to my male colleague, and made a real point of refusing to even look at me, much less,
Ah,
much less speak to me. And it
yes.
was so odd and so pronounced that after it was over, both my colleague and the senator said, "What did you do to him?" I had never met the man before, but it's that kind of dynamic where someone with some power behaved poorly, but it wasn't the senator's experience. It wasn't my colleague's
Yeah.
experience. It wasn't something they would do, and so they thought, well, you must have done
Mm,
something to him.
right.
Um, and that's a dynamic that I think has happened a lot. That um, there have been men who have abused power. Uh, Often they pick on the more vulnerable
Yeah.
people. I remember hearing about Megyn Kelly, and she was harassed by Roger Ailes when she first went to Fox, when she was in her 20s. Later, as she kind of grew in prominence, that harassment stopped. It wasn't that she became less attractive or anything like that. It was that she was less vulnerable. She had a little
Yeah.
bit more power. Uh, and a lot of people who misuse their power, they do pick on or select people that they think they can get away with it, where they will not be believed. And often that is, young people, you know, women who within the church have not been entrusted with authority or responsibility, or frankly even believed as much. And there is a reckoning now that's coming, that is overdue. Um, that frankly, I think there's probably more reckonings yet to come, because there are times when the behavior is so widespread that it doesn't really even raise eyebrows anymore. But when the Houston Chronicle first released its expose, they started with the independent Baptist churches, independent fundamental Baptist churches, before moving on to the Southern Baptist Convention. The first church that was mentioned, Hammond First Baptist, was the church that my mother had grown up in.
Mm,
And the pastor of that church had made national headlines at one point for, as a 56-year-old man, he had transported the 16-year-old young woman from a troubled home that he was counseling across state lines, in
mm,
order to have sex with her, and then blamed it on her, saying that she had seduced him.
mm.
And there's something about, for a 56-year-old man who is the senior pastor of the church to think that that will work. It will work. It will convince people to say the 16-year-old from a troubled background seduced me, says something about the culture of the church and the norms,
Yeah.
and
That's
just the
right.
widespread beliefs. Uh, for him to think that that would be effective. And I think there have been far too many norms, within the country and within Christendom, within our Christian subculture within the country, that did not recognize the Imago Dei fully in women. Um, that did kind of just think, well, it really, it thought essentially it could be gotten away with, and then it just became so much a part of the culture that it was not recognized for the injustice and the abuse that it is. And now that a mirror is being held up, it's the reckoning is painful, but it's certainly overdue.
So, Cherie, I want to ask you to give some advice to women out there who may be feeling that vulnerability that you just described, and they are either having experience or feel they're in danger of experiencing some form of abuse. What advice would you give them for what to do now? And I know I'm asking you for general advice, that so much of this has to do with specifics of the situation, specifics of the personality and temperament. So this is not a one size fits all advice, but what are some general principles or encouragement you would give to women who are experiencing that particular kind of vulnerability?
Yeah, as you mentioned, so much of this really is contextual. But I think a few just sort of broad pieces of advice. One is to do your job, do it well, and don't be cowed. Two is to talk to others. If something has gone on that it shouldn't have happened, document it and talk to others right away. Third, I think, is just to be confident, um, to fear not, to talk to others, to do your job, to lean in. And, I think a lot of the abuse of power does depend in part on cowing and intimidating,
Mm.
fear, essentially shaming or scaring someone
Mm.
into silence.
Yeah.
And so some of the best advice I can give is don't be afraid and don't be silent.
It's great advice. Sure, I'm going to shift gears to more again about your trajectory, your experience, because you also mentioned that you came from a different part of the country. You were not from the Beltway, and so help us first of all, tell that story, like kind of your own geographic sort of background and cultural background that's so different from DC, and use that to help people who don't know about what it's like in DC, help them. It's like, here, like, what are some things you should know about what life in DC is like? Because I think many Americans just read about DC and they've now been conditioned to view it as the swamp, as a place of corruption and infighting and all of that, and where nothing happens, nothing good happens. What good can come out of DC? What would you, since you grew up outside, not in that place, but you've been living here for so many years, be the bridge person? What do the rest of Americans, what should they understand about what DC is like, what it's like to be a Christian in DC, but also just what they as Christians should know about DC?
Well, yes, as you mentioned, I did not grow up in the DC area or anywhere close. I grew up in a small town in northern New Mexico, and graduated from Los Alamos High, and found my way to DC after college. And one of the first things that really surprised me about DC is just I had heard kind of growing up with again, conservative extended family about DC is kind of like this den of iniquity. I was really struck when I first came here by, oh my gosh, there's so many churches and there's so many ministries and there's so many fellowships. You're working on the Hill, you're working in the State Department. There is a very vibrant, active series of Christian communities in DC. So against this kind of sense that somehow this is like a really dark, pagan, anti-Christian place, was surprised to just find so many vibrant, flourishing churches and communities and other believers. So that was one big surprise. I think it's become, well, it's so widespread to kind of cast DC as like the other, and they are all corrupt, and the people there are kind of like people who, they are villains who are kind of feeding off the good people of America. And one thing I would say to people is both for better and for worse, representatives are actually very sensitively attuned to what
Mm.
their constituents want.
Mm.
And if they are kind of a steady diet of outrage, often it's because that's what they think
Mm.
their constituents really enjoy
Yeah.
and or want to hear. It is very common for some of the biggest firebrands on social media to be different when the cameras are off and the phones are gone and what have you. A lot of the the well, a lot of the controversy, a lot of the fear, loathing, and outrage that is stoked because it works in terms of it generates attention, it generates donations, it drives turnout to the polls. It's what people seem to really dig.
Yeah.
And if people stopped digging it, it probably would stop happening. That's not to excuse a lack of leadership, but I guess it is to say that what you find in DC is not all that terribly different from what you find across the country.
I think that's such an important point about that. A lot of the political toxicity among our leaders is them reflecting what they think the base wants. And so, if as Christians we want something different, it seems to me that we really have to mobilize our voices to send a different message that we want something else other than this toxic polarization and condemnation of the other. And so that would mean we as Christians, followers of Jesus, we actually do need to mobilize our voices and actually connect with our representatives, connect with our political leaders to give them different signals other than the current toxic signals. What would you recommend for a Christian? What's the best way for them to do that, to send a more virtuous signal to DC that we want something else? Since you've worked in the Congressperson's offices, what works as a signal sending tactic?
I'll mention one thing that's very modest, which is when your representative does something that you're really pleased with, proud of, think advances the good, say thank you, or
Mm.
just to a staff person. So often it's the staff person doing the
Mhm.
work. Members are most likely to hear from their constituents when their constituents are infuriated. That's usually what they hear. And so, there is a kind of a steady diet of outrage that comes in, which helps fuel the performative outrage that you see many members kind of reenacting. They're essentially trying to take that rage and redirect.
Right.
And so again, it's very modest. It's not like it will change the course of the country, but if more Christians suddenly started thanking their members for things that went well, or work that was being done in the district, whatever it was, it would be a small way of changing the culture. Right now, politics, but also nonprofits, our fundraising is so built around fear,
Yeah.
loathing, and urgency.
Yeah.
Um, and for Christians to take a longer view of kind of looking at Philippians 4:8, focusing on what is excellent and good and praiseworthy,
Mm.
praising the praiseworthy, but also even thinking strategically about again, this is in some ways an exercise of creative power.
Yeah.
What is conducive to flourishing? What can we encourage? What things can we make happen? Towards the common good, as opposed to punishing those that we think are doing wrong.
I think that it's so insightful that so much of politics and nonprofit fundraising is driven on fear, driven on anxiety. And as somebody who's written about anxiety, it strikes me that one of the great contributions that Christians can make to the public space is to be the non-anxious presence, is to be the non-anxious voice, to injecting calm, injecting encouragement, injecting all those virtues that you described in Philippians 4:8. I think that's a wonderful vision. It's really the vision of the after party, that this project that we announced in collaboration with Trinity Forum, and we're in partnership with you on that. If you could say a little bit more about why you wanted to become partner with us on that, because we certainly welcomed it and believe it's such a strategic partnership, but say more from your vantage point why this work of the after party feels like something that's important for the Trinity Forum to be part of.
Yeah. Oh, well, we are big fans and excited to be partnering with you and David and Russell with the after party, in that we do see polarization kind of reaching toxic levels. And part of what I mean by that, and think I said this when we even hosted the launch, was that we've reached a point where it's around 20% of people on both parties who think that the country would be far better off if large numbers of the opposing party died.
Yeah,
Um, you know
it's
that,
sobering.
yeah, it's very sobering. Essentially, kind of harboring that kind of animosity on a mass scale. Uh, that's not only a spiritual distortion; that's a civic danger. And I wish churches were immune from this. They are not. And there is a lot of evidence out there that shows that in many ways, churches are among the places that are the hardest hit. There was a recent study out by Barna that showed that 40% of pastors were so exhausted, stressed out, and discouraged, largely because of polarization within their churches, that they were seriously considering quitting the pastorate. Um, that's insane. That almost half the pastors have gotten to the point where uh, they are just so discouraged by the toxic polarization within their own churches that they have thought seriously about getting out. So the effort to help create curricula and resources to equip pastors to resource their congregation, train their congregation, to help them kind of to deal with both the messages that they are receiving, but also the messages and the approach that they are internalizing and sending out, seems to me to be an urgent matter of the public good, and one of the reasons why we are really excited to be able to partner with you and David and Russell.
Well, we are too. And we're heading into the home stretch here. And Cherie, I end segments with guests by asking them 3 questions. And the reason I do this is because, again, I have found that it's so easy to talk about how bad things are. And it's easy to talk about bad faith. And this podcast is about good faith. So I want to make sure we always end by anchoring on the good faith. And by that, we do that by asking you 3 questions. The first, and they're about questions about good news, hope, and joy. So let's start with good news. Cherie, what piece of good news do you have to share with listeners?
Well, this isn't something late breaking. This is actually, I was having a breakfast this morning with a good friend, and she mentioned this quote by G.K. Chesterton. I was like, oh, that is great. Where Chesterton essentially traced 5 different times in world history where in his words, it seemed like Christianity as a faith was going to the dogs. And he said, each case, it was the dogs who died. And the good news is that our faith does not depend on the brilliance and good behavior of Christians. It rests, beyond is it beyond our pay grade, and that is good news.
That's a great piece of good news. Chesterton always comes through. Hope. So I'm interested in your answer to this question because it strikes me, even what you just narrated about some of your experiences of disillusionment of seeing Christian men behave so badly in a way that you were not expected. You could have easily gone down the path of cynicism. And yet, whenever I'm around you, I always experience you as a very hopeful person. So I'm super interested in how you answer this question. Hope. What personal practice sustains your sense of hope?
And I'm afraid it's going to be a very prosaic answer to your
That's all right.
quite profound question. But, I would say one of the things that always gives me hope is just spending time with loved ones, family, friends. You know, well, love and hope, of course, are related.
That's right.
And getting to spend time with people you love is I think, a hope-inducing exercise. And one other thing I'll say, just in terms of a more solitary practice, long walks and prayer. I think are a kind of grounding,
Yes.
recentering, hopeful practice as well.
Love it. All right, joy. What is one movie, book, or other content that's given you joy recently?
Okay, do I have to limit it just one? I'll give you a few.
Yeah,
You can
one. You
always
just pick your best.
okay. Um, Very recently, Friedrich Buechner's "Listening to Your Life." Anne of Green Gables. I'm going to Prince Edward Island this summer and just was rewatching it. And oh my gosh, what a delight. I mean, it's so schlocky, but really fun. And a book that I've read very recently, not a well known book, but actually had the privilege of getting to interview the author recently on a Trinity Forum online conversation. A guy named Mark Buchanan, and the book is entitled God Walk. And it's simply about walking as a spiritual practice. And being a walker myself, it was a joy giving exercise.
Those are lovely pieces of joy. When are you going to PEI for the Anna Green Gables? It's at Prince Edward Islands, right? Is
Yeah,
that where it
Prince
is?
Edward Island, July, end of July.
Oh my gosh, that is on our bucket list because the Chang women in our household are all, Anne fans, or most of them are, and that's on our bucket list. So I can't wait to hear more about that from you, Cherie, how that trip went. Cherie, it's been a joy. Speaking of joy, it's been a joy to have you as a guest here on the Good Faith Podcast and to be your partner on so many of our initiatives, especially the after party. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your wisdom as a wise woman to our listeners.
Well, it's been a delight. Thanks for having me, Curtis.
And listeners, thank you for listening in, and join us next week as once again we will gather around the campfire.